When the gong sounded for breakfast at 9 o'clock, it found everyone up and awaiting the summons. General MacArthur and the judge had been pacing the terrace outside, exchanging desultory comments on the political situation. Vera Clathorne and Philip Lombard had been up to the summit of the island behind the house. There they had discovered William Henry Bloor, standing, staring at the mainland. He said, "No sign of that motor boat yet. I've been watching for it." Vera said, smiling, "Devon's a sleepy country. Things are usually late." Philip Lombard was looking the other way. "Out to sea," he said abruptly. "What do you think of the weather?" Glancing up at the sky, Bloor remarked, "Looks all right to me." Lombard pursed up his mouth into a whistle. He said, "It will come on to blow before the day's out." Bloor said, "Squally, oh." From below them came the boom of a gong. Philip Lombard said, "Breakfast? Well, I could do with some." As they went down the steep slope, Bloor said to Lombard in a ruminating voice, "You know, it beats me. Why that young fellow wanted to do himself in. I've been worrying about it all night." Vera was a little ahead. Lombard hung back slightly. He said, "Got any alternative theory?" "I'd want some proof. Motive, to begin with. Well off, I should say he was." Emily Brent came out of the drawing room window to meet them. She said abruptly, "Is the boat coming?" "Not yet," said Vera. They went to breakfast. There was a vast dish of eggs and bacon on the sideboard, and tea and coffee. Rogers held the door open for them to pass in, then shut it from the outside. Emily Brent said, "That man looks ill this morning." Dr. Armstrong, who was standing by the window, cleared his throat. He said, "You must excuse any shortcomings this morning. Rogers has had to do the best he can for breakfast, single-handed. Mrs. Rogers has not been able to carry on this morning." Emily Brent said sharply, "What's the matter with the women?" Dr. Armstrong said easily, "Let us start our breakfast. The eggs will be cold. Afterwards, there are several matters I want to discuss with you all." They took the hint. Plates were filled. Coffee and tea was poured. The meal began. Discussion of the island was by mutual consent tabooed. They spoke instead in a desultory fashion of current affairs, the news from abroad, events in the world of sport, the latest reappearance of Loch Ness Monster. Then, when plates were cleared, Dr. Armstrong moved back his chair a little, cleared his throat importantly, and spoke. He said, "I thought it better to wait until you had had your breakfast before telling you of a sad piece of news. Mrs. Rogers died in her sleep." They were startled and shocked ejaculations. Vera exclaimed, "How awful! Two deaths on this island since we arrived." Mr. Justice Wargrave, his eyes narrowed, said in his small, precise, clear voice, very remarkable. What was the cause of death?" Armstrong shrugged his shoulders. "Impossible to say offhand. There must be an autopsy." "I certainly couldn't give a certificate. I have no knowledge whatsoever of the woman's state of health," Vera said. "She was a very nervous looking creature, and she had a shock last night. It might have been heart failure, I suppose." Dr. Armstrong said dryly, "Her heart certainly failed to beat, but what caused it to fail is the question." One word fell from Emily Brent. It felt hard and clear into the listening group. "Conscience," she said. Armstrong turned to her. "What exactly do you mean by that, Miss Brent?" Emily Brent, her lips tight and hard, said, "You all heard. She was accused, together with her husband, of having deliberately murdered her former employer, an old lady." "And you think?" Emily Brent said, "I think that accusation was true. You all saw her last night. She broke down completely and fainted. The shock of having her wickedness brought home to her was too much for her. She literally died of fear. Dr. Armstrong shook his head doubtfully. It is a possible theory, he said. One cannot adopt it without more exact knowledge of her state of health. If there was cardiac weakness, Emily Brent said quietly, call it if you prefer an act of God. Everyone looked shocked. Mr. Bloor said uneasily, that's carrying things a bit far, Miss Brent. She looked at them with shining eyes. Her chin went up. She said, you regard it as impossible that a sinner should be struck down by the wrath of God? I do not. The judge stroked his chin. He murmured in a slightly ironic voice, my dear lady, in my experience of ill doing, Providence leaves the work of conviction and chastisement to us mortals, and the process is often fraught with difficulties. There are no shortcuts. Emily Brent shrugged her shoulders. Bloor said sharply, what did she have to eat and drink last night after she went to bed? Armstrong said, nothing. She didn't take anything. A cup of tea, a drink of water. I'll bet you she had a cup of tea. That sort always does. Rogers assures me she had nothing whatsoever. Oh, said Bloor, but he might say so. His tone was so insignificant that Doctor looked at him sharply. Philip Lombard said, so, that's your idea? Bloor said aggressively, well, why not? We all heard that accusation last night. Maybe sheer moonshine, just plain lunacy. On the other hand, it may not. Allow for a moment that it's true. Rogers and his missus polished off that old lady. Well, where does that get you? They have been feeling quite safe and happy about it. Vera interrupted. In a low voice, she said, no, I don't think Mrs. Rogers ever felt safe. Bloor looked slightly annoyed at the interruption. Just like a woman, his glance said. He resumed, that's as may be. Anyway, there's no active danger to them as far as they know. Then, last night, some unknown lunatic spills the beans. What happens? The woman cracks. She goes to pieces. Notice how her husband hung over her as she was coming round? Not all husbandly solicitude, not on your life. He was like a cat on hot bricks, scared out of his life as to what she might say. And where is that position for you? They have done a murder and got away with it. But what if the whole thing's going to be ranked up? What's going to happen? 10 to 1. The women will give the show away. She hasn't got the nerve to stand up and brazen it out. She's a living danger to her husband. That's what she is. He's all right. He'll lie with a straight face till kingdom comes, but he can't be sure of her. And if she goes to pieces, his neck's in danger. So he slips something into a cup of tea and makes sure that her mouth is shut permanently. Armstrong said slowly. There was no empty cup by her bedside. There was nothing there at all. I looked. I checked. Bloor snorted. Of course there wouldn't be. First thing he'd do when she drank it would be to take that cup and saucer away and wash it up carefully. There was a pause. Then General MacArthur said doubtfully, it may be so, but I should hardly think it possible that a man would do that to his wife. Bloor gave a short laugh. He said, when a man's neck is in danger, he shouldn't stop to think too much about sentiment. There was a pause. Before anyone could speak, the door opened and Rogers came in. He said, looking from one to another, is there anything more I can get you? Mr. Justice Wargrave stood a little in his chair. He asked, what time does the motor boat usually come over? Between 7 and 8, sir. Sometimes it's a bit after 8. Don't know where that Fred Narcote can be doing this morning. If he's ill, he'd send his brother. Philip Lombard said, what's the time now? 10 minutes to 10, sir. Lombard's eyebrows rose. He nodded slowly to himself. Rogers waited a minute or two. General MacArthur spoke suddenly and explosively. Sorry to hear about your wife, Rogers. Doctor's just been telling us. Rogers inclined his head. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. He took up the empty bacon dish and went out. Again, there was a silence.